Hello, Jai Hind, and good morning. Today, I have an absolute honor to be in conversation with former Air Chief Marshal SP Tyagi, who needs no introduction at all. You all know him. He started his schooling from St. Xavier's, Jaipur, and then, of course, we know the entire story how he joined the NDA. And the he has been a very fine chief. He was commissioned on 31st December 1963. He has been a fighter pilot in the Indian Air Force and various things. I mean, of course, he needs no introduction at all. But one thing I am very, very intrigued to know. Just recently, we had this Operation Kaveri, where we rescue people from Sudan, and Indian Defense Attaché to Saudi Arabia, Colonel Grewal. Incidentally, we are from the same regiment of artillery, and we saw the video going viral. And just at that time, by virtue of having spent some time in Saudi Arabia myself, I was well aware of a story where Air Chief Marshal Tyagi, when he was the first defense attaché to Saudi Arabia, his experience and how and why the government decided to actually set up to send the defense attaché to Saudi Arabia, and his experience during the Gulf War at that time, because the Indian defense attaché to Saudi Arabia was looking after Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Yemen. Let's go ahead and let's discuss this with Air Chief Marshal Tyagi, sir. Sir, Jai Hind, and thank you very much for taking your time, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Major Shah. I'll be very happy to share my experience in the Middle East and my experience of evacuating Indians from troubled areas. Uh, but you will have to pardon me. It was 35 years ago, so there may be the odd memory lapse. Although I'll try and recount to the best of my ability. Uh, so shall we start then, if it is
Yes, sir,
okay by
please.
you?
Yes, sir, please, sir.
So why did the government decide to open a defense attache's office in Saudi Arabia? We need to get back to Saudi Arabia, to understand this. Firstly, also, before I get back to Saudi Arabia, let me assure you, Mohammed Saab, that this is not the first time India has evacuated its citizens from abroad. I think not one, perhaps the greatest evacuation that ever took place, where government of India was involved in moving our citizens to safety in our country from abroad, was the first Gulf War, when then President Saddam Hussein decided to occupy Kuwait, and I happen to be in Saudi Arabia. We have done this. The Indian Navy has played a very major role in it. So have the civil airlines. The Air India has done at that time it was a government-owned airline. Many of the airline crew has done a remarkable job of evacuating Indians from dangerous places. And of course, the Indian Air Force, it has sent aeroplanes all over the world to evacuate from some very difficult and dangerous environments. Uh, so I think we have arrived as a nation where I think the Indians can be proud that सरकार आएगी बचाने हमको. लेकिन first thing is पहला पहला major मैं छोटी मोटी बात नहीं कर रहा हूँ. The major evacuation was from the Middle East when shall I say the first before the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein decided to occupy Kuwait. So first, let me get back what I was doing in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, as you know, in the late 80s, this is before the breakup of the Soviet Union, the world was essentially a bipolar world, with the United States as one major power and with its allies, of course, NATO allies in particular, and of course the Soviet camp, because it was the Soviet Russia that was an entity at that time. We were non-aligned, and therefore our thought was that we will decide independently. Actually, till date, history suggests that we are still non-aligned. If you see how we have handled, in spite of being members of the Quad, in spite of being very friendly with the United States, how we have handled the Ukrainian situation. It's just because we have decided we will take decisions which are in our interests as opposed to belonging to a camp. Okay. So we were never really aligned. Now I go back to the late 80s, when I happened to be in Saudi Arabia. You must understand that in this bipolar world, we were considered by the Americans. You know, John Foster Dulles had once said, if you are not with us, you are against us. They were very clear. Either you join the Santosi Ato type of thing like the Pakistanis did, or you are not with us. Don't sit on the wall, don't sit on the fence, was their thinking. Because of that, we were considered as Soviet ally. That 1971 Indo-Peace Treaty of India and the Soviet Union didn't help. In the sense they felt, the Americans or the Westerners or the Western Bloc really felt that we were part of the Soviet camp. You will understand that the Middle Eastern countries, largely the oil-rich countries, other than Iraq and maybe, although not oil-rich, Syria, they were part of the Soviet bloc, although they claim to be non-aligned, and the Saudi Arabians, the Kuwaitis, the UAE were definitely part of the Western Bloc. The Western Bloc was their major consumer of their oil and also a major guarantor of their security. Now, please understand at that time, because Pakistan was part of the Western alliance, they were also providing troops, uh, trained manpower, and I'm talking of military manpower, to many of the Middle Eastern countries, that included Saudi Arabia. At that time, you remember, there was a brigade that had gone to protect the uh, 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 for training, but really the real purpose was to provide protection to the royal family of Saudi Arabia. How do we break this? We are non-aligned, but we are always thought of as Soviet allies. Saudi Arabia, although not a member of a treaty with the Western world, is this very much in the Western camp, in spite of its very strained relations with Israel, which was definitely part of the American camp as well. So, in that mahal, so to speak, I think India decided that we need to get military to military things going with the Saudis. So there was at that time around 600,000 Indians were working in Saudi Arabia. The expats were there, but there was no military to military contact. I have to say the military was largely controlled by the royal family. All the very senior members were, the thousands of princelings that existed in Saudi Arabia. Uh, in that sense, when I landed up there uh, to open the defense attache's office, there was a gentleman called Ishrat Aziz, who was then the ambassador. I think Mr. Aziz spoke Arabic and was somewhat not very fluent, but was a fairly big scholar of the Middle East. He had served into a lot of countries. Talmiz Ahmad was our consul general in Jeddah, and
Did you pick
he
up
too
any
was
Arabic
a
as
Middle
well?
Eastern guy. Sorry.
You as well? Did you pick up some Arabic, Arabi Malum? Shwe shwe.
Sorry, Talmiz.
Sir,
Did you
did you
say
also pick up any
anything
Arabic?
about Talmiz?
Sir, did you also pick up any Arabic while you were there, sir?
Well, I took some Arabic lessons here in India before leaving. Um, there was a ustad, who used to work in the Kuwait embassy, who used to live in Nizamuddin. and I used to go to his residence, and we hired him as a tutor to teach me Arabic. No, no, I mean, I have to say that I knew very shoya shoya is the
That's
word.
right.
Since you lived in
Aywa.
Saudi
Mafi
Arabia,
mushkil sir. Very mushkil.
and you are an Arabic expert. And no, no, and now it was 35 years ago, so I forgot most of it. Uh, yes, I did learn a teeny mini bit of Arabic, but not awfully fluent. I have to say it was more an introduction to the language than. Uh, I landed up there to ensure to see if we could make a breakthrough in military to military relation. So one of the things was that since it was a Gulf country, you know, where their oil is really where the Gulf is, at the mouth of the Gulf, uh, there was some discussion as to why an Air Force officer should go there. And why not a naval officer who will monitor the Gulf? But we used to have an attaché in Oman who used to monitor the Gulf, so to speak. So this was made a inter-service organization, or was it? I think there was shared loot in this foreign postings, and the army and the air force, sort of uh, divided between themselves. But long and short of it is that for me, it was a cultural shock. You must understand Saudi Arabia of today is very different from Saudi Arabia 35 years ago. Very different. It has moved on. It has liberalized. The present prince is another person, but it was a very conservative place. As in say 3-4 decades back. Uh, the Wahhabis were everywhere. The Mutawas were with the Dandas, and it was a very different Saudi Arabia.
Just for
But
our viewers, sir,
folk,
just for our viewers to understand, ladies and gentlemen, mutawwas are basically the religious police in Saudi Arabia who
oh
compel you,
yes,
to follow their rule. For example, if in prayer
very
time
true,
you have to be not seen in the on the street but in the mosque, the women have to wear abhaya and such things. So that's what Sir was talking about the
very
mutawwas.
correct, very correct. Yes, yes. Thank you for that explanation. Mutabas are the religious police. They wear the short robes, and and they have a stick in their hand, and they are correcting everyone, and they can be very painful. Well, they could be. Now so much has changed. Women are, I understand, are driving. They were not. They were banned from driving. Because some mullah had interpreted the word of Allah in such a manner. There you are. In a very conservative Saudi Arabia, I landed up from. Well, India is far more liberal than it used to be 35 years ago, but even then, it required a fair amount of cultural adjustment to get used to the abhayas. And remember, I was not born in Old Delhi near Jama Masjid, so I was not used to this culture. It took me a little while. But more importantly, I tried to establish contact as much as I could
You were born
with
in Indore,
the
sir. You were born
military
in Indore in
leadership
Madhya
of Saudi
Pradesh.
Arabia. Beg
You were
pardon?
born in Indore. You were born
I
in
was
Indore.
born in Madhya Pradesh only because my mother went for a delivery there. But actually, I'm a hardcore Rajasthani. I
Affairs.
grew up in Rajasthan. That's where the family came from. And I did all my schooling in Jaipur, some college in Jodhpur.
St. Xavier's,
I
sir.
say some college because at a very young age of 17 and a half, I joined the Air Force. So didn't stay in college long enough. In those days, there was metric, there was no class 12. So after metric, you used to join they had started a higher secondary scheme, but frankly, after school, you joined, after senior Cambridge or whatever,
Senior
you
Cambridge. Yes, sir.
joined
Got it.
pre-university class, and there was a 3-year degree course thereafter. So there was 4 years of college, but we were very young when when joined college. I was 14 or something. We used to do class 12 by 14 and a half. in that class 10, sorry. But back to Saudi Arabia. Yes, the Mutabas were there. They were correcting it. It was a very, I have to tell you that our first astronaut, Wing Commander Rakesh Sharma, um, there was a Saudi prince, Prince Salman, who had been in space, who had got a jolly ride in one of the American airships. Uh,
Oh,
and he invited all the astronauts of the world to Saudi Arabia. That's how Rakesh Sharma and his wife arrived in Riyadh. And Rakesh and I had, I was his former squadron commander in, when I was commanding a Jaguar squadron. By then, he was a very famous man as an cosmonaut, and but he chose to come and fly fighters, and I was his CO at that time. He landed up in Riyadh, and like all Indians, we look for the cheapest places to buy in Riyadh. The cheapest part was the old city of Riyadh. Uh,
the Bathas
so
towards
I
Batha, Hara.
took Bata. You're familiar with it. So I took Shri Rakesh Sharma and his wife. Oh, was it Rakesh was not part of it. Ricky was perhaps attending some conference. And myself and my wife, we took Rakesh's wife to Bata for shopping because that would be the cheap area, as you would know. Um, and one Mutaba came with the stick and said something about this woman is not covering her head. This
Oh
was
God.
Rakesh's wife, Madhu. So we said, I had diplomatic immunity because I was posted as a diplomat. Uh, so I said, in broken Arabic, tried to explain to him that, look, this lady is a guest of Prince Salman. And so, big deal. Who's Prince Salman? He's not bigger than Allah. So the word of Allah is and he sort of waved the stick at me, and I quickly told Madhu, I said, hey, this is Saudi Arabia. 35 years, you don't take panga with these guys. You just quietly cover your head, man. There you are. Well, we tried to break ice with the leadership of the military leadership. I'll confine myself to military leadership. So whilst the diplomats were trying to break ice, they had a bigger challenge. They used to look after people who would come for Umrah, for Hajj to Mecca. I was, of course, not allowed to go there, but I was trying to focus, and trying to build up relations with the Saudi military leadership. Now, I have to tell you that it was a hard task because they considered me as part of the Soviet camp, I guess. Whilst nobody really said it, I think at that time, if they thought like that, I can see why they might have thought like that. But on call-ons, formal call-ons to their chief of air staff, for example, I had to get used to the culturally, culturally the Arab land, and 35 years ago, just remember, it was very different Saudi Arabia. Uh, there was no sense of time. There was no, they were not an industrial society. So they had this Khema type of culture. No? That means the tent doors are open to everyone. Whoever passes in the desert, that is, I come from Rajasthan, no, which is desert country. The first thing you do is when somebody visits you, you offer him water because it's a scarce commodity. So they used to have an open door policy. For me, I remember I was later the air chief. If an air attaché or military attaché calls on the chief, the telephones are kept on silent for those 15 minutes. The chief is not disturbed or whatever. Nobody else is allowed to go into the room.
And
And
so,
it's
what
a
a coincidence!
one-to-one talk. But
You also
there,
discussed.
since they had, you will be familiar with it, Muhammad. They had this open door khema tent culture. So there, when I went in, I was escorted with great pomp and show to the chief of air staff's office. But he said, "Oh, sit down," and in Arabic he welcomed me, and There were, as you have lived in Saudi Arabia, remember, there were no cell phones in those days. You only had landlines. So I often say that first 15 minutes they take to greet each other on telephone. You pick up the phone when the phone rang at our place, and I would say hello, and somebody would say salam alaikum, and I would say walaikum salam, and I say sabal khair, sabal noor, something, and Allah khair. So greetings are going on. Then he will say, "Mean who's speaking?" So then you say, rakam galat, this is wrong number. So for 15 minutes are lost in greetings, and before you realize that you got the wrong number. Uh, so there, when I went there, I was amazed. 3, 4 guys were sitting there having tea. That you are used to that sweet Arabic tea uh, and sugary tea, and they were sitting, and he made me sit down. The chief, remember, he was the chief. I was only the air attaché. And we sat, and there were jokes, exchanged in Arabic, which I only partly understood. And then I thought, I need to talk to this guy. I have a purpose. Why I'm not called here to have tea alone. I mean, to know him, but also to ask him if we could be of any help, if we could, send some Air Force guys to our staff colleges and NDCs and such like things. But it was difficult to talk because he was busy on the phone. Phone kept ringing. Guys kept coming in and going out. But they were very comfortable with this culture. And please don't misunderstand me. I'm not. This is not a criticism.
No, no, of course, of course.
Who are we to criticize? Who are we to say ours is a more superior
No, no,
culture? All
absolutely,
I'm saying it is different. That's
absolutely, I get
all.
that. Yes.
And so don't take it as a
No,
criticism
no, of
of,
course,
of,
absolutely,
of the
get it.
Saudi system. It was different. And therefore, since I was an outsider, it took me a little while to get used to this idea of the Khema culture. As it used, I'm sure it must have changed enormously in 35 years since I was last there. Uh, Idea was to see if we could make a breakthrough and get some Saudis to attend our institution. Now, they used to attend the staff colleges in Pakistan, national defense colleges, etc., in Pakistan. Many were trained in Pakistan. Some of the ships I visited, for example, the naval guys were said we were trained, and of course you are familiar with this. They won't say Pakistan; they will say Pakistan. So in
Pakistan,
post
yeah.
71, that is what we call them anyway. So
Pepsi,
it was
Pepsi would be,
Pakistan.
Pepsi would be
They don't
Pepsi.
use the word "pa" in Arabic. Yeah, correct.
No, no, no
Uh,
parking here. No barking here.
don't bark here. So I said, no, I'm not barking. But what he means is no park. Don't park here. Yes, you're right. But I have to, in this, say that we were not awfully successful. In the sense, in my tenure, nobody came. No, I was unable to convince them to send because the world was a different place. 35 years ago, there was a Cold War on, and uh, they were not keen. Let me put it this way. Today, I'm very happy to report, and nothing changes in one day. Today, the Saudis are coming for NDC and various other courses to India. Much has changed. Saudi government has given the highest award to our prime minister. Blah blah blah. We have moved on. But I'll tell you, Ambassador Aziz, his entire team, that included me, we tried very hard to break the ice. It was very difficult in those days to do that. We were still considered, we were, well, after the breakup of Pakistan, we were one of the largest Muslim nations in the world in the total population growth. But we were not really considered an Islamic country, right? We were also, as I've explained, considered, if not part of the Soviet camp, at least leaning towards the Soviet Union. So there were very many reasons why it didn't work as well as we would have. But I would like to say that nothing changes in one day. The world doesn't change. I'm not a messiah. a prophet who will come and change the world. ये बाबा इसमें बहुत टाइम लगता है ना. नेशन टू नेशन में रिलेशनशिप में भाई, आफ्टर ऑल जर्मनी एंड यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स वर एट वॉर इन वर्ल्ड वॉर 2 ना. फिर दोस्ती हो गई तो, बट लेकिन टाइम लगता है ना. मेनी थिंग्स हैव टू चेंज. So I'll just say that whilst we made some success, we perhaps took greater credit than we deserved of breaking the ice. It was very difficult at that time. Uh, I also think that today they are a far more professional force. They've also been fighting in Yemen and various other places. Than they were 35 years ago. They were very young country, a very young force, still controlled largely by the royalty, and they have come a long way. I have to tell you that our mirages were ferrying through what is it, Qatar in Doha, and former NDC commandant. I, I'm trying to recall his name. He was from Jaipur, Lieutenant General. He had got a job as advisor to the defense minister, who was the crown prince of Qatar. So I landed up in Doha to look after the mirages who were ferrying through Doha. And that is because Qatar Air Force also used to fly mirages, and there was a Dassault presence there. Uh,
Well, an
I tried
Indian
to get
retired,
in.
an Indian
Sorry?
retired general, an Indian retired lieutenant general as the
As
military advisor
commandant
to
of
the
NDC. I'm trying
ex
to something
commandant of NDC as
FNDC.
advisor to the defense minister of
He
Qatar.
was advisor to the defense minister of Qatar, who was the crown prince of Qatar. So,
Okay.
the cabinet consisted largely of the royal family, right? Uh, I met him and I said, "Bhai, there was a 50 member Pakistani troop there, a huge office they used to run, who are all military advisors to the Qatar government." So I said, "What is this Indian doing in Qatar advising the defense
Yeah.
minister?"
Yes,
And
sir. Absolutely.
I set up a meeting with him. And since we were both from Jaipur and I spoke Rajasthani, I established contact with him and I said, "Sir, I'd like to meet you." And we met in a hotel lobby, the hotel that I was staying in, for coffee. And I said, "Sir, I'm very keen." And he came with a sofa and earrings and pierced. He was looking like a Rajput king, right? And he belonged to the royal family of Jaipur. He said, I said, "What kind of advice do you give to the Qataris?" There is a 50-member bloody Pakistani office here to give defense advice. तो तुम क्या advice दे रहे हो? उसने कहा, "नहीं यार, ये देखो, ये वो पेपर वेपर लिखते हैं ना पाकिस्तानी तो, how to join armor and air and together you attack and all that." So ऐसे पेपर तो मैं भी लिख सकता हूँ, मैंने एनडीसी कमांड किया है, इसमें क्या प्रॉब्लम है? मैं इनको करेक्ट एडवाइस देता हूँ. I said, "What is the correct advice?" This is, "You must understand, Shashi Tyagi, that I come from a feudal family of the Maharajas of Jaipur. प्लीज अंडरस्टैंड यार, ये नहीं होता." मैं इनको कहता हूँ, "तुम आर्मर को और एयर को साथ में मत मिला देना अंडर वन कमांडर, नहीं तो तुम्हारे पैलेस पे अटैक कर देगा वो." उसको दुश्मन से तो नहीं करेगा. तो मैं उसको करेक्ट एडवाइस दे रहा हूँ कि इसको अलग अलग रखते हैं, तुम वहां आर्मर रखो, इधर एयरफोर्स रखो. And it was quite fascinating, really. Please understand that even in Saudi Arabia, they didn't keep the tanks and the tank carriers in the same place. There was a 3,000-kilometer difference. Oh, tanks were in one corner of Saudi Arabia, and the tank carriers were in another corner, so that you can't move easily. So they were scared of, so much has changed now. I'm talking historically speaking. They, after all, the challenge was more internal than external at that time. They were after their historically. Please understand that the king of Saudi Arabia was overthrown whilst he was on a trip abroad. Saud was overthrown, right? Uh, and people within the family sort of challenged the kingdom. So there were very good reasons for this kind of thought process. uh, let me now move on to with this background, and it is the largest background. I told you, we tend to get lost. And certainly, while Palestine was a big event in the Middle East, and our Muslim Brotherhood, and this, that, and the other was going on, certainly Mr. Saddam Hussein, who had been financed by Kuwait and Libya and Saudi Arabia because they were fighting the Iranians. Remember the great Iraq-Iran war? That time, $35 billion came from these oil-rich nations because he was doing their job, fighting on their behalf. He was fighting the Shias of Persia. But once the Iraq-Iran war finished, and I may quote Major Saab, that Henry Kissinger had once said of the Iraq-Iran war. It's the tragedy of Iraq-Iran war is only one of them can lose. Uh, so that is the kind of feeling people had. They wanted Iraq to lose and Iran to lose too. That's it. So what I'm trying to get at is that in this milieu, after the Iraq-Iran war ended, I do not know why, what happened. Without going into great details of that, Saddam Hussein marched in and occupied Kuwait. Now, Kuwait is a city-state, as we know. It's actually a very small place. The Iraqis rolled into it with tanks and armored vehicles and infantry, and almost within a few hours, Kuwait had been occupied.
There's a gentleman in the background, so you can tell him we can take some rest. There's a gentleman in your
That
background.
is, yeah. Well, we know that this happened, and now the problem was, remember, Kuwait had actually financed the Iraq-Iran war. I mean, they had financed Saddam Hussein, along with Saudi Arabia and other oil-rich countries. But certainly the occupation of Kuwait, and therefore the Kuwaiti oil wells. Now, remember where the Kuwaiti oil wells are. The Saudi oil wells are not far from the Saudi-Kuwaiti border. The Dharan area, you are familiar with the eastern part of Saudi Arabia. That is where the oil, I mean, there is no oil in Jeddah. The oil is all in the east. And that is very close to the Kuwaiti-Saudi border. So there was a scare that Saddam, now that he is successfully occupied without firing a
Towards
shot
Tamil side,
virtually.
sir. Towards
Beg your
towards Tamil,
pardon?
you mean? Towards Tamil side,
Yeah,
sir.
that is correct. So I'm suggesting to you that the Saudis and indeed the Western world was scared that Saddam might not stop in Kuwait. He might also occupy the um, Saudi oil wells in the east. As you are more familiar this than I have forgotten
No,
more
too
than
much.
than you know about Saudi Arabia. Uh, Please understand that eastern portion of Saudi Arabia, where the oil wells are, also this where the Shias live, and it became a challenge. So therefore, the Saudis were a worried lot that, and they used to keep them Shias under a fair amount of control. I have to I have to tell you that, because their loyalties were suspect, and they used to think that they might switch sides to Iranians. Although there was, they used to speak a different language, they're culturally different from the Persians, but that was the feeling. Essentially Wahhabi command, not quite fond of the Shias because the Kuwait had been occupied, and I've explained to you, the Western world said, no, you cannot do this. Next step is Saudi Arabia. If Saddam is not stopped in Kuwait, he will occupy the oil well. And if he had occupied the Saudi oil wells, please understand that he would have been commanding more than 50% of the oil of the world, oil assets of the world, between Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabian oil. He would have been the champion of oil. And that was a very scary thought, particularly for the West, since he was considered a pro Soviet individual. So, therefore, a dictator was fine. I mean, monarchy of Saudi Arabia was fine. The Kuwaitis monarchy was fine. But they were pro West. So, it was fine. The dictator in Pakistan was fine, or Latin America was fine. So, that's the world we existed in. Okay. Um, well, so did the Soviet bloc. They can care less what kind of government you ran, provided you are pro-Soviet, right? Uh, I have to say that because that happened, large-scale movement of American arms and personnel started taking place to defend Saudi Arabia. One of the things was this Saudi royal family's welfare was guaranteed by the Western world. That's why the Pakistani troops there. That's why they had very close relations with the Western world, and virtually guaranteeing that the monarchy will continue. Okay, the family will be looked after because it was a family.
It could be somebody
It
from
is
the
a
royal
private
family of
limited
Saudi Arabia
company.
calling you up, sir. It could be
Sorry.
somebody from the royal. It could be somebody from the royal family of Saudi Arabia calling you up, sir. You can attend to that call.
I'm sorry about this.
No, sir.
My former chief is calling, but I don't want to disturb this. Uh,
So, please, you.
well, because of this background, the Americans started landing in large numbers. Now, please understand, Saudi Arabia was, if they had to come close to Kuwait, then they had to land at Riyadh. Darren, but there was no point landing at Jeddah. It was too far away. So they started arriving in Riyadh. Now, please understand, Riyadh had two airfields, one Air Force airfield and one Riyadh International.
King Khalid International Airport and
I
Saudi
used to
Airport.
live very close to the Riyadh Air Force airfield.
Oh, okay,
And if
sir.
I
In
went on my
Suleimania.
rooftop,
That was
I could
Suleimania
see
area,
all
sir.
the aircraft. Sorry?
Was that Suleimania area, sir?
Suleimania, yeah. But
Sure,
but
sure,
at that time, Riyadh only had Suleimania.
sure.
It was small. Remember, in that time in Riyadh, there were no numbers of housing. There were no names of the streets.
Oh,
You
yes.
won't believe
Oh,
this.
yes,
If
sir.
you had to go to somebody's place for a meal, you said, "कहाँ रहते हो भाई?" So वो कहेगा, "पेप्सी कोला कंपनी जानते हो?" हाँ जानता हूँ. अच्छा वहां से राइट लेना लेफ्ट जाना, because there was no address and there was no GPS in those days. So actually you had to you had to do this anyway. I could see the Americans landing, their AVAX is landing. Yeah, they were landing at the Riyadh International, which I could was far away, but what they were doing, and the tarmac was full of American equipment. This is when I shifted goals, and those were my last few days in Riyadh. I was to end of the year. I was to head for back for India after completion of 3 years tenure there. So one of few things that I learned. You will never know as a defense attaché because you don't have an intelligence setup. Incidentally, you are not supposed to be a spy. You are a diplomat, yeah? And you don't try funny tricks, right? But you just keep your eyes and ears open. One of the things I learned was I told you the story of how I went and called on the chief, and he gave me very little time actually. Although I sat for 45 minutes there, the conversation was limited. One of the things I realized during that war was that the best source of information comes from uh, pressmen, media. Because the media, you see, there is protocol to talk to the chief. I, I I'll take a long time, right? to get an interview from him. He'll say he's busy. No, no, because you are a colonel here, you group captain. Who cares for you? But the media guy, even a young 25-year-old, and you are part of this system now, you can walk in anywhere. Yeah. You can interview the president of the country. You can interview the prime minister of the country, etc. etc. So the access available to them was far greater than. So they could interview the American generals, the Saudi generals, and all that. I couldn't reach them. So I found that the best source of information, and not only me, uh, I was in touch with the other defense attaches as well. What is happening in Saudi Arabia to find out? I found that the best sources were the journalists, other diplomats,
Very
but guess where they were getting information from? Journalists. So at that time we found they had a far greater access to the monarchy, to the Americans, to the PR, American PR, than we had. In fact, as diplomats, we were kind of suspects. They were not. So we learned that the Americans were coming, and there was a lot of speculation of whether they will open up this front or not, or will they just protect Saudi interests? Okay. Long and short of it is, you know the names better than I do. Kuldeep Sindhu arrived and relieved
Oh
me, and
yes.
I used to send long dispatches to. Now this is the other problem. At that time, the cipher was all book cipher. So the cipher guy used to say, "ये तो इतनी लंबी मैसेज है आपने इसको मैं कैसे cipher में भेजूंगा?" He used to take hours. But that was the need of the hour, and I had to speak to the ambassador. I said, "ये तो भेजना पड़ेगा भाई. What? How many American troops have arrived? Where have they deployed? What are they doing, etc., etc." Many of the things that I remember is many of the Sindhis of Dubai got very rich at that time because the Americans arrived, and the Saudis cannot. So the portable air conditioners were not the thing 35 years ago. They used to supply ice to Saudi Arabia from Dubai, in shiploads of ice to keep the things cool. Pankha chala diya, baraf ki silli rakh di, ab thanda kar diya tent ko. But living in tents, there was no accommodation, right? All the hotels had been taken over by the Americans. But the fact is that there were only a few hotels in Riyadh in those days, and therefore most of the troops had to live in tents, and it can get extremely uncomfortable in the desert. So suddenly the logistics, food had to be supplied to the troops, uh, and you lived in Saudi Arabia, but booze had to be supplied to the American troops. So Dubai got into business, and
Just for our audience,
many.
just for our audience. So I correct me if I'm wrong, sir. As far as my knowledge goes, that Saudi Arabia is a dry country. There's no alcohol allowed, but there is, as you said, a diplomatic immunity. That was
Yes.
the diplomats had that
Well,
privilege.
now that you brought the topic of booze, my interest has come alive. But please understand, Saudi Arabia was a dry country, and an Islamic republic. They could not officially permit the defense, or sorry, the diplomats to enjoy diplomatic immunity with alcohol. Okay. So, no, the diplomatic community did not have a carte blanche that they can do. But we had an arrangement. The arrangement was that the embassies would go to the Saudi Foreign Office, okay, and say, we had to declare we are going to import the following items and the quantities, okay, and they would, officially they could not permit. They would say, okay, agreed, you go ahead. Now we had to order it from Switzerland, and it would come. Why Switzerland? Was because there was a company that used to do special packaging so that if the bottle breaks, it doesn't slip out of the. So it had a foil cover and all that. The packing used to cost a lot of money. Because the duty free booze you could buy from Dubai, that was cheap. In those days, that was the cheapest place on the planet. But yes, we used to do. So whilst we are on the booze front, please understand that the Americans didn't care whether if their bottle leaked, but they used to also have the same arrangement. So I understand that once an American ambassador got his crates, and it was lying in Riyadh airport, or was it in Dhahran port, or whatever, or Jeddah port, and one of the bottles broke inside and it started leaking. So there were code name for booze was furniture. Has the furniture arrived? Has the furniture arrived? And everybody understood in Saudi Arabia what furniture was meant. So when the booze started leaking, apparently somebody called up the American ambassador and he said, "Sir, your furniture is leaking. I suggest you pick it up from the customs. Your furniture has started leaking." So it was, the condition was, whatever you do, diplomats enter, in Delhi, for example, diplomats will sell booze. They'll get diplomatic immunity and then sell it in the open market. At one time, it was a big racket. The smaller embassies, in particular, with the not so well paid diplomat. In Saudi Arabia, they said, "Oh, you can import it, but don't enter the market. Whatever you do, you cannot sell it." Because selling it was the privilege of some of the royalties. You've lived in Saudi Arabia. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of princes. Not everybody is rich. So their stuff is never checked by customs, or wasn't in 35 years ago. I don't know what the situation is now. And the market was controlled by them. So we couldn't enter the market. This was one of the conditions. All right. So I was asked when I got back to India, do the Saudis drink? And my contention, remember, moneyed people behave in the same manner all over the world. Whether it's America, Europe, India, or Pakistan, or Saudi Arabia, the jet set is got the same values, the same way of living. They wear the same clothes, designer clothes. They eat the same kind of food. They drink the same kind of booze. So I used to often say that I met only two kinds of Saudis: those who could drink and those who could not afford to, because the price of booze was very, very high in the market. Uh, just leave the booze part. I'm sorry, this was a diversion.
It's very interesting to hear
I'm
you, but
saying that Saudi Arabia saw an enormous influx of American weaponry. Now, you couldn't train the Saudis to operate that weaponry, not in a short while, right? So it was the American manpower as well. I left Saudi Arabia and I took over command of the Air Force Station Jamnagar before the war started. But they were parked not only in Saudi Arabia, largely in Saudi Arabia, of course, but they were also parked in UAE, in Oman, in the neighboring countries as well. When the war started, remember, Saudi Arabia, before the, when sorry, not the war started, when Saddam occupied Kuwait, remember, we were 600,000 Indians, roughly.
so I'm aware of
Ambassador Aziz,
one story where you drove with Mrs. Tyagi. You went to
yes,
Kuwait
I will just
and you
come
had
to that.
assured the Indians over there that we are here to help you out, and we would like to know about
Yes,
that
yes,
story as well,
yes,
sir.
yes. So I'll just recite that. Please understand, there are 600,000 in. Large number of them live, are on the eastern front, close to the Kuwaiti border, because that's where the oil is, that's where the industry is, and things like that. Well, two stories that there was panic. If Saddam is going to occupy the oil wells of Saudi Arabia, remember there were around 100,000 or more than 100,000 people in Kuwait. I forget the number now. Indians in Kuwait. Now the one problem was they're all stuck because the Iraqis are everywhere. Good thing is New Delhi and Baghdad had very good relations. We were both flying MiG 21s. Remember, we were operating the same tanks. We were kind of not tilting. Gandhi had said, no, we'll tilt. We stand straight. We don't tilt anywhere. But the fact is, we were both operating a lot of Soviet equipment. And therefore, Baghdad and Delhi were friends. Our foreign minister was Mr. Inder Gujral, who was later the Prime Minister of India. Uh, they had contacts with Saddam. But there was panic, in the Indian community because 600,000 Indians that time would say, हमारा क्या होगा? हम कहाँ जाएंगे अगर सद्दाम आ गया? They were already close to 100,000 stuck in Kuwait. Many of them started walking towards Saudi Arabia and crossed the border
Oh.
and came into Saudi Arabia because all other routes were blocked. The airport was closed. There were no flights, right? There was no shipping. Okay, because there was no Kuwaiti government now. Remember, it was only Saddam's forces which were controlling. So people in panic, some of them left and started moving towards Saudi Arabia and crossed into Saudi Arabia. Two things I want to mention. Panic in the हमारा क्या होगा? अगर ये कमबख्त आ गया तो हम कहाँ जाएंगे? Okay. I was asked by Ambassador Aziz to make what was known as a tentative plan. Now, they were using my military expertise. Tentative plan, supposing if the embassy has to be closed in Riyadh and withdrawn, what should be the plan? Where should we go? Because the airport may be closed, and Riyadh is not next to the sea. My argument was that why should embassy close? Let there be war, but we should not close because there are 600,000 Indians. We should not close. So they said, look, we are not planning to close, but we just want a tentative plan. Supposing if push comes to a shove, what do we do? So they wanted to use my military expertise to get a plan going. So I had made it clear to my ambassador then that I will make a plan. Now that you have given me the task, how to go by road, what route to take, because supposing there are no flights, uh, not to go to the eastern coast because that will be the war zone. Head toward Jeddah and try and get out from there. But I had promised him. He says, sir, the military department will not move. We will stay back. Even in a tentative plan, the defense attaché and his staff will not leave. ये तो फौजी है यार, ये वर्दी पहनते भाई, लड़ाई से थोड़ा अरे छोड़ के चले जाओगे ऐसा थोड़ी होगा, मैं तो नहीं जाऊंगा. उसने कहा नहीं भाई प्लान बनाने में क्या है? मैंने कहा नहीं तो मैं तो प्लान भी नहीं बनाऊंगा सर, जब जाना ही नहीं है तो प्लान क्यों बनाना? आपके लिए मैं सबके लिए प्लान बनाने को तैयार हूं. फैमिलीज होंगी यार, उनको निकालना पड़ेगा, मैं मानता हूं ये बात, और फैमिलीज तो हमारी भी निकलेंगी, लेकिन हम नहीं जाएंगे. ये हम आपको अभी तो बता रहे हैं, आप जिसको बताना है दिल्ली में बता दें, हम तो छोड़ के नहीं जाएंगे चाहे सद्दाम यहाँ आके बैठे आए रियाद में, कुछ भी हो जाए. Then when the panic started and the telephone started buzzing in the embassy, अरे आप हमारा क्या कर रहे हैं? How to evacuate us from the eastern front of Saudi Arabia? Please understand, United States couldn't have arranged departure of 600,000 people of their citizens. हमारे पास कहाँ 35 साल पहले कहाँ रिसोर्सेज थे यार, कैसे ले जाओगे? तो जब आपने ये बात याद दिलाई मेरे को, तो मैं एम्बेसडर साहब की इजाजत से, लेकिन बिना सऊदीज के, देखिए हमारा को सऊदीज से परमिशन लेनी पड़ती थी टू लीव रियाद. If any time we went out of Riyadh, we had to inform them. I did not. I said, मैं जा रहा हूँ, मेरे को तो पता ही नहीं मैं जा कहाँ रहा हूँ, कहाँ जहाँ जहाँ भी इंडियंस मिल जाएंगे मैं बात करूंगा. सो माई सेल्फ एंड आई ट्रेवल्ड इन यूनिफॉर्म. नॉर्मली डिफेंस अटैचेस डोंट wear uniform only on ceremonial occasions. They work in CVs. But I wore my uniform and drove along with my wife. And my wife said, बच्चों को छोड़ के कहाँ ले जा रहा मेरे को? So the children stayed back. But I said, नहीं, तुम्हारा चलना जरूरी है. And I went to the East Coast. And then I asked the local leadership, Indian leadership, to say that up get many people. I want to talk to them. So they used to arrange a hall type of place and gather people, and I would address them. I said, यार आप सुना डरे हुए हो, घबरा रहे हो, इंडियन एम्बेसी क्या करेगी? एक चीज बताओ, आप अगर आप एम्बेसडर होते तो आप क्या करते? 600,000 6 लाख लोगों को कहां से लाओगे? इतनी शिप्स, इतनी एयरक्राफ्ट, 6 लाख तो नहीं उठा सकते. अब रही बात भागने की, यहां छोड़ के मत जाना. बड़ी मुश्किल से सऊदी अरेबिया में अच्छी नौकरी मिली है तुमको, रियाल में पैसा मिल रहा है, मत छोड़ के जाना. कुछ नहीं होने वाला, घबराओ मत. अगर कुछ होने वाला होता तो मैं अपनी बीबी को लेके आता, तो इसको तो घर पे छोड़ के आता ना. अगर मुझे आपसे भी बात करनी थी तो मैं रिस्क नहीं लेता. फिर मैं आपको बताना चाहता हूं that I drove right up to the Kuwaiti Saudi border and I found that the Kuwaiti border was controlled by the Iraqis. उन्होंने तो अपने ट्रूप्स लगा रखे थे. So I said salam alaikum to them, and in my broken Arabic, whatever I could converse with them. And but I went around meeting any number of Indians to say, hey, everybody stay quiet, don't worry, we are going. And I said, I will remain in Riyadh no matter who was, and you can all come to my place, don't worry. What is the number? So there, I think in याददाश्त तो कमजोर है मेरी, 35 साल हो गए, लेकिन आई थिंक इट हेल्प टू से दैट अरे यार ये जेन्युइन आदमी. एक तो फौज पे विश्वास करते हो, है ना, compared to let's say civilian employees. I'm not saying they are bad, incidentally, it's just a perception. तो उन्होंने कहा ये आया है और अपनी बीवी को लेके आया और कुवैती बॉर्डर तक जा रहा है, तो ठीक ही होगा यार, फिर लड़ाई तो नहीं छिड़ने वाली, तो बैठे हो यहाँ पे. I don't know, some might have still continued to panic, but large majority were felt reassured, is the word. But I did mention that many people from Kuwait had come into India. Okay? Sorry, into Saudi Arabia. They had crossed the border. अब वो तो बेघर बार थे यार, वो तो कुवैती लेबर था, है ना. कोई पैदल चल के यार अफसर तो नहीं आता ना, कोई जो कॉर्पोरेट वर्ल्ड में काम कर रहा है वो तो नहीं आएगा. तो लार्जली लेबर लाइट. They all headed in the direction of Saudi Arabia, and then we took charge of them once they entered Saudi Arabia. Now the story is, whilst they were there, we opened full marks to our ambassador and his team. They opened a camp. ये कहाँ रहेंगे? तो जो इंडियन एम्बेसी का स्कूल था उसको डॉर्मेट्री में कवर कर दिया गया. तो मुझे अब नंबर्स याद नहीं है, इट मस्ट बी इन अ फ्यू हंड्रेड्स. उनको उस स्कूल में ठहरा दिया गया. देन वी आस्क्ड द इंडियन पॉपुलेशन, एंड रियाद में कितनी पॉपुलेशन है इंडियंस की, लार्ज नंबर ऑफ पीपल. दे हेल्प्ड with beddings and and sleeping bags and food and things like that. And Sayyid Akbaruddin, he was I think second secretary or first I think he was a very young officer at that time. He later, as you know, became our permanent representative in United Nations, and became a renowned diplomat. Very good Hyderabadi. It will be of interest that he had a Hindu wife, and उनके घर में जाओ तो कलमा भी पढ़ा जाता था और कुछ कोई आरती भी होती थी उनके. wonderful man, and extraordinarily fine diplomat. As he turned out to be a very intelligent man, he was made the officer in charge of that camp. I was only involved in he had military knowledge of running a camp. The camp was run with a large help from the Indian community, and then since the air and sea traffic continued between Iraq, between Saudi Arabia and Delhi, they were then sent back to the country. But यार ये तो 600 लोग आए थे, कितने थोड़े से लोग आए थे, few hundreds. Almost 100,000 people तो were stuck in Kuwait. And I think we started off with this, the largest evacuation till that time, bigger than the Berlin airlift, started with Gujaral Saab, and he visited Baghdad incidentally. He was very much criticized कि ये साला बगदाद में क्या कर रहा है, तो सोवियत कैंप वाले हैं सब. But we were planning to meet the Iraqis, use our friendship to whatever extent, and excavate our personnel from Kuwait, which was an occupied country. And I had come back to India by then. Once the deal was stuck with the Iraqis, they allowed us to land in Kuwait International. And I will tell you one thing. India put their best foot forward. The ships, since Kuwait is a port, and the number of aircraft and Air India flights and Air Force flights and whoever, we chartered aeroplanes. Remember, we used to do it only for Hajj till then.
Yes, sir.
This time, we did it for evacuating our personnel. The largest, at that time, I don't know, since then I'm not familiar, the largest airlift in history was done from Kuwait. It was bigger than the Berlin airlift, which we were all taught as young
The movie
officers.
made on that as well, sir.
You know.
Akshay Kumar acted in that. Airlift. There's a movie also which was
So
made.
I'm saying since then, so many countries, Yemen and many African countries, India has evacuated personnel. The Indian Navy has done a marvelous job of this as well. The C-130s and the C-5s of the Galaxies of Indian Air Force have done a remarkable job of lifting. And today, I think we can say with some deal of confidence कि यार आप इंडियन हो, आप जहां भी हो, भारतीय सरकार आपकी मदद करने वाली. Because today resource position has changed, our thinkings have changed. But when you mentioned the evacuation from Sudan, for example, so many memories came back that the largest evacuation in history perhaps took place at during the Gulf, well, not the Gulf War really, but during the Kuwaiti occupation of by Iraqis. So that is my story of the Middle East. Like I said, before the Americans decided to take on Saddam in the Gulf War One, I had moved out of Saudi Arabia, and बाकी कहानी तो कुलदीप सिंधु सुना पाएंगे वो
Of course, sir. So Colonel, that time Colonel Kuldeep Sindhu, and very fine officer. Then I think General Shah took over from him, sir. And General
That
Shah
is
came and
correct,
met
sir.
you. He came and met you in Delhi when he was before he
I
went.
met General Shah. In fact, I met him, I think, a few weeks back. टकरा गए थे हम. He's a very fine countryman. Somebody I'm very proud wore the Indian military uniform. Very, very fine officer. And more importantly, but you can't be a fine officer without being a gentleman. So he's a gentleman.
I had the
You
honor
both
and
go
privilege
together.
of serving. I had the honor and privilege of being General Shah's ADC, sir, when he was commanding a corps.
Very good. He's a brilliant man. And his contribution to the nation has been acknowledged, and is considerable. Considerable.
Sir,
He
sir.
was, known as Nasiruddin Shah's brother, but I think Nasiruddin Shah should be known as his brother. Uh,
True, sir. Very true, sir. Very true. Very well said, sir. And then, of
Oh,
course, then
okay,
comes.
Muhammad. All the very best to you. Thank you very much. This
Thank you
is,
very much, sir.
I mean, I'm sorry. It was so long ago. Memories fade. I'm not a young man with a bright memory. Whatever came into my mind, I have sort of shared with you.
Sir, you were so candid and you spoke from the heart, and it was so, I mean, it was really mesmerizing hearing you, sir. And then, sir, I think that time Colonel Surinder Singh talked
नहीं नहीं
about
नहीं
something.
नहीं यार, सभी आर्ट से करते हैं। अब खुद याददाश्त बीच बीच में ख्यालात इधर उधर चले जाते हैं, मालूम नहीं पड़ता, भूल जाते हैं वाकई में हुआ था कि नहीं हुआ था। याद करने की कोशिश करते हैं, यह बुढ़ापा इसी का नाम है।
Sir.
ऑल द वेरी
Sir,
बेस्ट मेट,
thank you, sir. Sir, and you, in the
ऑल द
beginning
वेरी
of our
बेस्ट।
conversation, you mentioned there was a naval defense attaché in Oman at that time. If I
आई गेस
remember
देयर वाज,
correctly, were you referring to Commodore
yeah,
Khan? He
I
belonged to
I
Major
I
Shah.
I remember meeting him, but I, because I had gone, एक आर्मी चीफ थे, जनरल शर्मा, आमद कोर वाले थे वो, जिनके अपने फर्स्ट पीवीसी के भाई थे वो। जनरल शर्मा, व्हेन ही वाज द आर्मी चीफ, ही वाज विजिटिंग दुबई। ही वाज एक्चुअली ब्रेकिंग जर्नी इन दुबई। वो कहीं से आ रहे थे, यूरोप से, आई कांट रिमेंबर। तो मुझे भेजा गया था रियाद से टू लुक आफ्टर हिम, to liaison, look after means there was enough people to look after him as a serving army chief, but to organize a few things. That was because the अपना जो naval attaché था ओमान में, he was not available. So I remember driving for 13 kilometers sorry, driving for 13 hours from Riyadh to दुबई। 13 घंटे मैंने कंटिन्यूसली ड्राइव किया था बस।
Sir.
चलो भाई,
Incidentally, you mentioned
ऑल द
about.
वेरी बेस्ट टू यू,
Sir,
सी यू
incidentally,
देन
you
ऑल,
mentioned.
एंड व्हाट डू दे से, besides Allah bkhair, what do they say, ma salama, yeah, okay.
Ma salama before journey, before
Yeah,
one voyage.
yeah,
Yes,
see
sir.
you, bye bye, bye
Sir,
bye.
thank you very much for such a pleasure and such an honor being in conversation with you, sir. Sir, बहुत मजा
Thank
आया,
you
sir.
very
शुक्रिया
much,
बहुत।
all the very best to you, mate.
Thank
Bye.
you, sir. Bye, sir. Jai Hind, sir.